What's happening, people? Back with another reaction, back with some more punk rock, and we're back with some more Propagandhi, arguably the greatest band ever. Certainly always a contender for my favorite band ever. I've told the story many times, so I'll be brief, but they were the first like real legit punk rock band I discovered, and they led me to discover other bands and various authors and a number of ideas which still serve as major influences in my intellectual, philosophical, and ethical outlook on life. So again, big ups to Propagandhi now, in the past, and forever. We're going to listen to a tune from their Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes album, and indeed we're going to listen to the title tune. I've reacted to a couple tunes from this album, but not the title track. I do think that's a very simple yet powerful phrase, Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes. The idea that even the biggest and most famous empires that lasted, centuries, if not millennia, most of those are, now covered in dust and sand, and future societies that, understood them only imperfectly and so on. Meaning nothing lasts forever, meaning even the most powerful people and the biggest empires eventually wither, fall apart, and the people that constituted their leadership end up dying or so on. So it's, that famous, here is Ozymandias, King of Kings, and then the statue over time gets weathered and, sort of reduced to sort of a hunk of stone that barely resembles what it used to be, and that is itself a sort of telling marker of the mortality and the finite nature of living things, including humans. So yeah, I do love that simple phrase, and I think the song specifically is about American history and about how, as long as those of us who are listening to this video as I post it would have been alive, the United States is one of the biggest empires of the past, I'd say 150 years or so, certainly since, the mid-19th century onward. Ultimately, the song is about many things. I'm an academic historian, so I do want to sort of defend the discipline of history, which is as distinct from the past. The past are things that happened. History are accounts about things that happened. And so obviously, we historians, we try to use primary sources, which is to say documents and materials that were from the very events and processes that we are studying and we try to write about in our history, as well as secondary sources, people who have come after and tried to understand and use primary sources to make an argument. And historians now, you try to take as many primary sources as you can, but you also see what other people, what other historians and anthropologists and other scholars are saying about these different episodes and events in history. And of course, humans, we like to categorize things, and that happens in academic history where we apply these periodization labels. We just, this is the Renaissance, and this was the Scientific Revolution, and this was the Enlightenment, and this was this era. The reality is things are far more complicated. We're talking about, thousands of miles of geographic territory, centuries of time, like scores, hundreds, thousands of people, some of whom never met, some of whom have vastly different ideas from one another about the very things they purport to have supposedly, characterized, which is to say, people in the Enlightenment, different contributors, people who are considered sort of fundamental to that intellectual movement. There are many cases where they had different ideas about the very same things. And so the idea that, well, though the ideas of those authors characterize the Enlightenment, it's like, well, which ones? And ultimately, some of these people never met each other. They never read each other's material. So to say that they sort of characterize something together is at best a sort of like anachronistic connecting of the dots that may not have been connected in the time. So the reality is academic historians, we don't agree about very much. We have all sorts of like micro detailed arguments that we make, and then people come from another angle trying to write another argument, but they end up sort of picking some of what you may have written but then disagreeing with other parts of it and so on. That's not to say that there aren't consensi that emerge over time. There certainly are, but even then there will be outlier historians and so on. And as with any discipline, academics, There are historians who practice their craft more scrupulously, and those who maybe cut corners or even fudge entire footnotes and just, oh yeah, I got this from some book that I'm just making up or whatever. Thankfully, it doesn't happen too often because, with peer review and so on, you try to get away with that kind of stuff. Eventually, people are going to notice. But this is all a discussion about academic history because the song talks about there is often a gap between history, meaning accounts about the past, and truth. And while that is absolutely true, and I would never deny that, I would say in many cases it may not be this cynical thing. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certainly historians and politicians trying to, pick and choose little bits from the works of different historians to then justify some, again, like oppressive policy or a anachronistic and, patriotic or nationalistic worldview that is then used to permeate the culture in some sort of totalitarian way or whatever. So, bottom line, academic history and even, popular colloquial history, they are certainly part and parcel to what goes into, the making of nation states in the modern era and all the sort of brutalities and sort of xenophobic impulses that can entail. But I would just say that the gap between history and truth isn't always cynical, and oftentimes it just relates to the simple fact that the historical record is incomplete, meaning like, even when you're studying something that is, very well attested, there were all sorts of documents being written at the time and, lots of people involved, so there were lots of things being preserved from different places and so on. Even then, there are gaps, there can be sort of ambiguities, and you just think about like, when you have a conversation with someone talking, there are all sorts of subtleties, body language, like spacing of the words, positioning of people, like the way someone might choose to sit in a particular part of a room with certain things behind them. There are all sorts of little details that if you just look at a transcription of a conversation on a page that do not necessarily emerge or don't clearly emerge or might be more subject to misinterpretation. And people talk about that with text messages, like someone telling you something with a sarcastic tone of voice or like a wink of the eye as they say it. Okay, they're being cheeky, but sometimes you get a text and it's like, it's just the words on the screen, and I'm not sure exactly the tone of that or how to take it. And so that's the reality is there are large episodes in history that there's nothing left. There's nothing to tell us about, there was nothing written, whether it's because the culture itself did not have a written language system or because, that culture has been largely, thousands of years ago. They existed thousands of years ago, so most of their material cultures have withered or basically been lost. So in many cases, historians struggle to get at the truth of what happened simply because we don't have enough details or documents to make a notable claim. And, more scrupulous historians have basically ingrained the idea in their head that you don't claim what you don't really have the ability to, which is to say you can speculate, but usually then you have to wave the red flag of, hello, this is speculation, this is not something that, I have document to support, this is just me wondering whether this might be the case. But again, I'll slow down on the historical, the academic history conversation, but this song absolutely gets at that, and it talks about how things like Shays' Rebellion and sort of, the way that the colonial backwoods viewed the ratification of the Constitution, which, if you didn't know, Shays' Rebellion was sort of something that to many people exposed the insufficiency of the Articles of Confederation, which is the first sort of federal document that said, where these United States are going to try to work together, which, if you know the history, they originally saw themselves as states, what we might call countries today. They're like, oh, we're a bunch of United States. But then eventually Shays' Rebellion, which is about taxation and an increasing desire to extract taxes from property holders and so on. It was met with great resistance, and even some of the veterans of the Revolutionary War, including Daniel Shay, were involved in this rebellion. But again, it led some people in the wake of it to say that there had to be some greater like centralization and formalization of the rules between the various states and so on, which led to the Constitutional Convention. Nevertheless, the song is basically about how people on the margins of these big processes and the formation of the United States were actually very wary about the Constitution. They were very wary of this centralization of these federated states. And the song ends with saying that the people in the backwoods, when they heard about the ratification of the Constitution, they sort of symbolically painted a coffin in black and buried it as emblematic of their loss of liberty based on these new centralized rules and so on. Now, I would argue that a lot of those very same colonial backwood citizens probably didn't have the most admirable cultural attitudes about various things that we might be concerned about now. Of course, you shouldn't overgeneralize. There were people advocating for decent treatment of Native Americans and the abolition of slavery and so on. Even at the Constitutional Convention, I did a lot of research myself about Gouverneur Morris. He was a peg-legged guy from New York. You should really look him up. He's a crazy historical figure and one of the most interesting founding fathers. But he vociferously argued against slavery at the Constitutional Convention, spoke more than any other person at the convention, and again, a lot of what he said was denouncing slavery and wanting it to be no part of this new nation state. Now, because of the concerns about losing all of the southern states' support for this new constitution and so on, that his ideas about slavery were never pursued. But just to be clear, and not to whitewash this person entirely, he was skeptical of full-blown democracy because of what was happening in France. But nevertheless, there were people at the Constitutional Convention who were aware of the irony about talking about breaking off, the bonds of tyranny and so on. And it's like, well, but there's like some of you literally own people who are in chains right now. Nevertheless, let's get to it. This is Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes on the album Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes by Propagandhi. Is this 2001? I'm blanking if this is 2001. I'll look it up in a second, but I think that's right. Apologies. You get me talk about history, and I'm just going to go on for hours, so I do apologize. Yeah, 2001. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. There certainly is a lot of Disney-fied history, but again, not the same as academic history. Nation is actually a ethno-linguistic term. Draw your own conclusions there. Like the state is one thing, the nation are the people that live there. Yep. And if we humans don't get our act together, I think everyone's going to be ash, not just the empires. I do love this sort of ramping down of the song. A lot of emotion in that guitar, sort of the ending of the piece. Which, I don't know if I mentioned this specifically, but I will say one thing that I've noticed in the evolution of Propagandhi sound, I think I've talked about it in other videos, sonically, they went from more of what is sometimes called a skate punk sound, although even then I think to call their first album skate punk, even just sonically, is an oversimplification. Chris's guitar work and some of the crazy riffs and the tempo changes, it doesn't scream skate punk to me, at least. It doesn't sound like other bands that I remember from the 90s that are more, I think, properly considered skate punk. But it's not just that they evolved from that sound, whatever you call it, into a more melodic and maybe even slightly metal tipped hardcore punk sound. It's also that the early songs, they have a lot of energy, a lot of aggression, and one or two have sort of some considered it atmosphere, obviously Haile Selassie, Up Your Ass. That song has a sort of dramatic kind of atmosphere, but I will say most of their songs in the first couple albums had this very direct, and again maybe energetic, but a very direct sort of sound. As the albums progress, and I think starting with this one, certainly when you get to Potemkin City Limits, and then especially beyond that, the emotional character of their songs, I think, has gotten stronger and stronger. And there are a lot of songs where, whether it's a guitar riff or it's the way Chris sings a line, there's a lot of feeling in their songs later. And again, not that there wasn't passion or energy in their early songs, but I don't remember a lot of their stuff from the first couple albums as having this oh man, it kind of it makes me a little emotional as I sit here. But there's been multiple songs from later albums where I've done reactions to. Adventures in Zoochosis was the clearest one. By the end of that one, I was right on the edge of getting choked up in my throat a little bit. But yeah, the ending of this song, it has that same it asks you to emotionally consider the intellectual information that you've just digested. So anyway, I do apologize for the big bit up front about history, but this song is about history and the way that the writing of history, and which is to say accounts about the past, can diverge more or less from what actually happened in the past. So I felt like there was a reasonable attempt for me to try to get some of my professional interest in there. Nevertheless, let me know what you think of this song. I do think it makes perfect sense that this song title was used as the name of the album, because it's just such a powerful phrase, and also I think it is one of the better songs of the album. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any more requests, either Propagandhi or other punk bands. Other than that, thank you for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.